morning. Today, July 15th, 2013, we are in the Heinz Suite in the Sheraton at AALL's annual meeting in Seattle. We are joined by Jerry Dupont, the founder of the Law Library Microform Consortium and its current Associate Director for Content Development. This interview will be part of the oral history of law librarianship on Spinelli's Law Library Reference Shelf. Thank you again for participating in this project, Jerry. We'll start at the very beginning. Where were you born and raised?
I was born in Marquette, Michigan, 1939.
And you spent a number of your earlier years in an orphanage, is that correct?
Right.
How did those earlier years influence you, or did you learn any lessons there that carried to today?
Well, I imagine everybody, that was first 11 years, and everybody learned something in 11 years. I guess you learn a certain amount of self-reliance, and my particular situation was fairly fortunate. It was a nice place, people like me, I like them, and so, yeah, you learn what you learn from your friends in your first 11 years.
Very good. You went to St. Mary's College for your undergraduate education. How did you choose that college, and what did you study?
I got a scholarship. That took care of the choice, and basically undergrad stuff. I majored in philosophy, did a lot of Latin, German, and Greek. So basically philosophy and languages.
And how did you choose those areas? Did you have a lifelong interest in them, or?
Well, the philosophy thing was there, and it sounded interesting. And I was always heavily interested in literature and stuff, so it seemed like an easy move over.
And how did that lead to your working with the U.S. Army Security Agency?
The Army Security Agency was not really my choice. In those days, the draft was in effect. And as soon as you got out of college, unless you could afford and had a graduate school to go to, you were in the Army. So my real choice was, do I do 2 years or 3? If you did 3 years, you got some amount of choice as to where you went as far as training. So I wanted to go to the Army Language School in Monterey and took the exams for it and passed they weren't that hard an exam. They basically wanted to know if you'd ever seen another foreign language and if you were afraid of foreign languages. And once you got past that point, they took you. And so, yeah, I traded a year for the advantage of going to the language school.
And what did you do?
What did I do?
Right.
Once I was done, I was a low-grade spook, which means you sat on the border between East and West Germany. In my case, I could have been in worse places. That was a very nice place. And you just listened on the radio to the Russian troops talking and passed it on to Washington.
And then you started law school at the University of Michigan in 1964. At what time did you realize that you wanted to pursue librarianship instead of practicing law?
I hate to say it, but it was a pure accident. I was planning, I knew that once I became a lawyer, I would probably get trapped into some kind of career where I could never have any fun anymore. It's sort of the way I was looking at it. And I had a chance through relations to go on the Great Lakes and work on an ore carrier, and was going to do that for 6 months and then go out and practice law. And unfortunately, there was a recession that year, and the traffic on the Great Lakes went down, the job I was supposed to get didn't happen, and all of a sudden I needed to work. And I heard that they were hiring over in the law library, and went over and found out that there was such a thing as a law librarian, and applied for it.
So 2 questions based on that is, one is, had you practiced law, were you focused in a particular area?
Not particularly, no. The reason I went to law school is I thought of it as one of the careers that would give me the maximum flexibility later on, both as to what you did and where you lived. And I very much thought of law as an opportunity to live somewhere else than where I was living, and to do something other than what I was doing. Right. It just seemed a much more open profession, and that's the way it turned out to be.
And when you went to the University of Michigan to work in their library, was it as a reference librarian or in a different capacity?
Yeah, started as a reference librarian, and I had good luck that everybody above me kept getting hired somewhere else. And so within the first year I was head of reference, and the second year I was assistant director. And that's the way things worked in those days.
And how many people did you supervise in each of those positions?
We had, I think, if I remember right, there were about 70 people in the library, of which 30 were professionals, and I think the rest were FTE. Remember, these are FTEs. There are actually more people than that. So about 30 professionals and about 40 non-professionals.
And did all of them report to you?
Well, by the time I became assistant director, yes, especially since one of the reasons I became assistant director is that my boss was going off to Africa for a sabbatical. And his choice was to either get his sabbatical in Africa or stick around and look around for somebody else. So there was no search. He went to Africa and I took over running the library. It was great fun.
Now, were you in library school at the time you became associate director, or did you enroll before?
The Michigan offered me a free library science degree. I think on the theory that I would take a very long time doing it, and that way they'd keep me around longer, and it worked out that way.
And how would you say that libraries have changed from the time that you began at University of Michigan until now?
It's a totally different world, just vastly different world. Just to show you how electronic it was, the director came up with some project where I needed an adding machine, or at least a calculator. And we had one calculator in the whole library, and it belonged to the order department. And that was wheeled into my office on loan for 4 days so I could do this big project. It was on a huge table. And then after they sat around panting for their adding machine back, and then it went back to but that was the biggest thing we had, and the most elaborate thing we had in the library.
From Michigan, you moved to Hawaii in 1973 to become the first librarian at the University of Hawaii's Manoa William S. Richardson School of Law. What unique opportunities or challenges did you encounter in that role?
Well, it was certainly a change. Michigan at the time was one of the 5 biggest libraries in the country, and while the dollar has moved up since then, it'll give you some idea of the smallness of the situation I moved into. The founding budget was $79,000. So,
did you have any ability to negotiate that, or that was just what you were
that's
doing?
what the state gave. That wasn't my salary, that was what the state gave for the book budget for founding the library.
And was there any library at all, or you built it from the
We
ground
started
up?
from scratch. We started in Quonset huts and moved on from there.
And did you build it entirely from those funds, or did you give donations? Did you solicit donations from others?
Solicited little donations, managed to go to the legislature year by year and work it up a little better than that. But it was very slim going for the first 5 or 10 years.
And since you were the first librarian, did you have any unusual duties there that you wouldn't have had elsewhere?
If you're in a small faculty, you automatically do a lot more work than if you're in a large faculty. And there were only 5 of us to start the law school, which meant that you're on every committee going. I ran admissions for 9 years. I took care of all the buildings, which sort of served as the assistant dean for physical facilities, that kind of thing. And you just ended up on every committee going. If you want advice in life, go to a big school where someone else will carry the load. It's very tough to work, especially at a very small school, and get things started.
So if you were to give advice from other librarians who might be considering taking jobs at startup schools, what one piece of advice might you give them?
Be prepared to work very hard.
Fair enough. You founded the Law Library Microform Consortium in 1976, and in at least one interview, you mentioned that LLMC was essentially your attempt to preserve our heritage before people idiotically throw it all away.
Yeah, that interview was actually tied to the digital era, because people weren't throwing away books back in 73 when I started the law school there. And in fact, the whole law library world worked on a volume count basis. Libraries were ranked on how many volumes they had, so nobody was going to throw an extra volume away or the dean would be on their case. So it was a different problem. We were trying to build a sensible library for a small school. We had no desire to build the Harvard Law Library and to build a building that could hold 1 million volumes. That wasn't our goal. What we were trying to do is get a sensible collection together at the least cost. And in those days, the way to, especially for the less used materials, the obvious choice was microforms. The idea of being put the stuff that's most used, put that in hard copy on the shelves, and all your less used materials, if possible, get in microform. And so that was the philosophy that I sold to the school. The problem was the industry at the time the microform industry, which is basically about 7 legal publishers who had their hands in it to one degree or another, just wasn't building collections that were usable for those purposes. They were doing 2 things. They were, one, cherry picking the most used materials and putting those on microfilm. Well, nobody wanted to read the Supreme Court opinions on microfilm. You know, you want to read that in paper if you're going to go back more than once. So the wrong things were being microfilmed in a, I think, misguided attempt by the publishers to attract the lawyer market. They weren't really thinking of the law school market. The lawyer market was much bigger, but the lawyer market never ended up buying microform, so it was misguided. The second problem is that the microforms of the day were way too overpriced. And to give you a sense of what overpriced means, if you bought in 1973, if you bought a reprint paper volume for a set, the average price was $32 for the average reprint volume. The average price for a microfilm of the same thing was $30, which means the price differential to induce you to buy microform was so small that you'd say, well, gee, I may as well pay the extra $2 and get the book. So we knew that that whole situation had to change, and that explains why, out of necessity, in those days, Wayne State University Law School, with which I happen to have very good connections, said, why don't we start doing this stuff ourselves? That explains getting into it.
So did you get a grant to acquire the equipment, or how did you
We
start
went out and got loans. It was a sort of a scam in a way. We told the potential donors that they could get twice for their money. That if they would give us the money to start, we were looking for about $120,000, which in today's terms is around $600,000, $7,000. And that would be enough to get the ball rolling. And the theory was that if we could once start selling this, we could pay back the loan money. And they could use their donations for another charity. And in fact, that's what happened. Eventually, we paid all the money back, and both donors ended up giving it to different charities.
Now, were these individual donors or corporate donors?
It was 2 different kinds of donors. The gentleman at Wayne State, who's the dean, his name was Donald Gordon, and he had been on the UH faculty and went back to become dean at Wayne a year after we started. He came out to help start us, and then he went back to be dean. And so he had asked, he said, when they try to make you dean, they give you a pot of money usually. You know, they'll say, that's part of your bargaining, and the one time you bargain is before they get you. Mm-hmm. So he had bargained for a pot of money to improve Wayne State Law School. And he was saying, Jerry, can you suggest anything I could do to improve the library? So I said, well, you give me $60,000 and we'll do this project. So he bought into it, and he went back and raised his money basically from the car companies, from Ford, GM, from that market, our market of donors. And I raised our money. There was a wonderful man called Stuart Ho, who was a Michigan graduate 1 year ahead of me. And he bought into the scheme on the theory that if it was one of his friends from Michigan, there must be something sensible about this. So he committed to raising his $60,000 in Hawaii. He's an interesting man because his grandfather, if you ever read the book Hawaii, that's the whole family, the Chinese family in Michener's Hawaii. That was his grandfather, and that's where their money came from. But he raised the money from various donors in Hawaii. And when he got his money back from after we paid it back, we paid it in fiche. And he ended up giving $250,000. He bought the fiche at cost. I used his money to buy it at cost and gave it to Chinese libraries. So the ripple effect, we did a bit of good in China too. That was just after the Cultural Revolution when they were bringing their law schools back. And so we gave fiche to 13 Chinese law schools.
That's a fantastic partnership.
Yeah. I got Christmas cards for literally 20 years thereafter.
How did you gain the expertise that you needed to actually perform the work necessary?
Actually, the technical side of it didn't take that much work. It's not that hard to take a camera and point it at a page. I mean, essentially, you just scale it up. So I learned that part of it fairly quickly. In fact, the harder part was the business side of it, making the thing work. And microforms was not an easy business to be in. The reason why it wasn't easy is because it's a matter of choice as to when you buy. So, as you well know, if a library's budget starts getting cut back, there's certain things you have to keep, and there's other things you defer to the next year. Well, microform had that unfortunate attribute that it could always be put off for a year. So the course of the business side of it was like riding a Ferris wheel or something. You were up, things were doing very well, and then within a year you could be practically broke. And it was very hard to keep that side going. I decided very early on that I didn't know enough about business to do this well. So I went and took an MBA part-time at the University of Hawaii. And it was seriously helpful to do that. That was probably the harder part of it. As far as the mechanics, it's not rocket science. You can quickly buy the machines, learn how to do them, get yourself a good technician who will pay attention to the rules, and you're off.
And when did you decide to move digital? Was there a triggering event, or?
Yeah, there was a triggering event. In fact, it's interesting you're doing this interview in this room because the triggering event was when Hein went digital. And the reason for that is I could see it coming. No one didn't see it coming. Everybody is saying eventually everything's going to be on computers, is the way they phrased it then. Digital wasn't used much. But the problem was, to serve our market, the library market, we could not send stuff off to be keyed in China or wherever people were keying it in. People, in order to get rid of the books, had to have an exact duplicate of what they basically needed. Electronic microfiche. That was the problem. And the technologies that came along first, especially when Lexis got started, Westlaw got started, was all keying in. That was of no use to the libraries. And so we had to wait for the technology to come along, basically PDFs, digital imaging. And I knew that Hein had deeper pockets than we did. And so I must say I watched him very carefully because he was doing the same thing. I watched him. Was he going to go into CDs? No, he didn't go into CDs. And he judged correctly, I think, and we judged also that CDs is not the way this is going to go. The idea that people were going to have platforms with 700 CDs on them and trade between them, that just is, no library was going to work that way. And so we watched the enthusiasm for that go by, and then when I finally saw him go into imaging and saw his product and say, okay, now it's possible. And so we basically waited for the guy with the most money to go out there and get his feet wet.
And how did you decide what materials to digitize, or when you were doing microform first?
In both cases, it's very similar to what we did in both cases. Part of what we're doing, part of what LMC is doing is selling space. We're not just selling materials, we're helping libraries cope with their space problems. And so you keep that in mind very much when you're, so therefore, sure, you're going to put the US reports on, but you've got to do that, everyone has that. But you keep a very wary eye on where the libraries have their greatest needs. And since we're very much addressing that need for them, and our board knows each one, every person on the board for years was an academic librarian. They knew exactly where the space problems were, and they also knew what they'd be willing to get rid of first. The only difference between the digital era and the microform era is that, in fact, people did not want to get rid of their books in the microform era. So to the last day, they would keep their books, even if they had an alternative on microform. They would still keep their books as long as they possibly could because of the old volume count thing. And to be fair, because people would have preferred to use the books than use the microfiche. But once digital came along, that whole world changed, just changed almost overnight. I must say I was shocked how fast it happened. I knew it would happen, but I didn't expect it to happen almost within 1 year. All of a sudden, the whole mood was different. The users did not want to use the books anymore. Literally, if the book was on the shelf behind them, they still kept looking at their screen and hoping it would show up in digital. So in a world where we used to have to borrow the books to film them and mail them back to the libraries. It was a very tedious business. We did an awful lot of shipping of books.
And a lot of and expensive.
And expensive, although fortunately the post office let you do it with media rate. So that was always one of our least expenses. But the sheer tedium and the staff costs of packing books and keeping track of them, that has changed completely. Now 90% of the books are one way. They come to us. Now, it's two ways because, as you know, we keep the paper stock in salt mines. So it comes to us, it gets disbound, it gets scanned, gets shrink wrapped, and then it goes off to the mines. But it's a much easier world than it was in the film days.
So talk a little bit about the mines, how you selected them, what was important to you in the selection?
Well, we didn't really start out with mines. I knew that if this process was going to keep going the way it was, we were going to start turning common books into rare books. People were not paying much attention. Is anybody throwing away the last copy of this thing? I also knew that there was at least a slim possibility, and that possibility still exists. We've reformatted these same materials twice in my lifetime. So there's no guarantee that 30 years from now, it may not be necessary or desirable, one or the other, to reformat them again, and it may or may not be desirable to do it from the original paper. So we said, basically, we're going to have to save this stuff, and we came up with a lot of different possibilities of how we might store it. And then finally, we're thinking mines, and I checked out stone mines. They don't work well because they are very dirty. And the dust inside, even if it's granite, the dust just permeates everything that's down there. Secondly, they tend to be close to the surface. And when they're close to the surface, in fact, they need artificial air conditioning to keep the temperatures at the appropriate thing. And with one try or another looking around, we finally heard the word of these salt mines, 650 feet below Earth, with constant temperatures, no artificial outside. They could survive a nuclear attack and they would just sit down there. So that's how, after maybe about a year of looking around, we said that is the ideal solution because you're basically not paying to keep your air conditioning going. And it also, fortunately for us, is very cheap. The books down there are being stored at 10 cents per volume per year, which has got to be a record for any library storage situation going.
And you stored just one copy or multiple copies?
Just one copy. Now, to be fair, I mean, the librarians are glad we're doing it, and we're glad to be doing it because why not be cautious? The reality is probably that they will not be used. So we're being very extra cautious, which is another reason why we were looking for a very inexpensive solution.
Sure.
And at 10 cents per volume per year, that's as inexpensive as you can go.
Now, when you founded LNC, did you have any idea that it would grow to be what it is today?
I thought it would grow. In fact, medium Bill Hine, not the granddad, but Bill asked me, how big do you think this thing is going to grow? And I thought it would grow to about $2 million a year in revenues, that the need that it was trying to serve and the number of libraries that are involved and the types of libraries. Obviously, law firm libraries, we're not going to buy a lot of microform. So if you look at who's out there, I thought the market was probably worth about $2 million a year. The microform never grew that big. I think the biggest year was about 800,000. The digital has grown to that. And remember, the digital is doing much the same space recovery mission that the microform was. So we knew that there were only so many libraries out there. There's 200, just a little bit over 200 American law school libraries. There's 22 Canadians. The numbers are very finite, so you can pretty well predict where it's going to go.
Do you have a lot of, outside of Canada and the US, any foreign purchasers of your material?
We've got a couple in England, Tel Aviv, a couple in Australia, a handful. It's basically a North American operation.
And do they find you, or did you find them somehow or another?
The overseas ones?
Yes.
The overseas ones we more or less found. Although I know, wait a minute, I'm sorry, Tel Aviv was a volunteer. They came, they emailed in and said, we'd like to be part, so great.
So in addition to preserving legal information generally, LLMC has lent a helping hand to those in need. It created the Haiti Legal Patrimony Project, a project that ensured that Haiti retained access to its legal documents after the 2010 earthquake. On a more local, but no less meaningful level, LLMC has lent equipment to Hawaii State Archives or other libraries. Were these types of projects always part of your vision for LLMC?
Yes, we, as far as the being charitable, we weren't being charitable, but we're also being self-serving. There are some institutions that have materials that they just can't let them out the door. A good example is the Hawaii State Archives. The first time we did this was back with Yale and the Yale Blackstone collection. Yale happens to have the world's most complete assembly of Blackstone materials. They were never going to ship those to Hawaii to get done. So that was our first example of having basically an external site. And we did that in the Yale's graduate library. We actually contracted with their people to do it. The next one was at Berkeley, where, I don't know, you probably know that they have a very important canon law collection, maybe the second best in the world after the Vatican. And obviously they're not going to ship those to Hawaii either. So we put a camera in there for, I think it was 4 years, and did not only a basic canon law collection, but we also did civil law France, civil law Germany, Italy, and the Iberian Peninsula. So we were used to doing that. Come into the digital era, by the way, those were very difficult projects to handle. Microfilm has the disadvantage that the materials have to be processed immediately after shooting them, which means that you are just sitting there with all kinds of chemicals, and you've just got a whole horrible panoply of things you have to keep going, and it all has to be right, and you don't want to do it if you could possibly avoid it. With digital, you've got a much better world, because all you need to do is keep your capture mechanism there, and you can instantly get your images back for processing back home. So it's a much easier, simpler operation. So now we have a total of 5 such operations out, one at St. Louis University, one at GWU. We had one in the Hawaii State Archives, and the reason we had it there was couldn't get access to the material otherwise. And the reason we picked them, to be very honest about it, is University of Hawaii has given us free rent for now going on 37 years. And so in exchange for a copy of everything that we do. So it's not free rent, but it's a nice exchange. And because of that, I've always tried to do special things for them. And that material has been sitting in the archives, unavailable to most people forever. Well, all of a sudden we went in and just did all their legal material, the minutes of the Privy Council during the Hawaiian Kingdom, stuff that was great, but that nobody had ever seen. And now it's available all over the state. So there was certainly one hand washing the other reason for doing that. The Haiti thing was different. That was after the earthquake. We were talking amongst ourselves, all the librarians on the LMC board, and we're saying, well, gee, we'd like to help. And I suppose we could put the word out and ask everybody to give $20. You know, and we feel good about it, but not much would have happened. And then we said, well, wait a minute, we know how to build libraries. And we saw the pictures of their libraries pancaked, you know, and lost. And we said, well, look, why don't we just build them a digital library so they don't have to build a... So we got started on it, and we merged the Columbia collection and the Library of Congress collection. Those 2 collections among them came up with 420 titles. Of course, some of the titles are big, you know, multi-volume, but 420 titles. And then we threw it open to our whole membership. And by the time we were done, those 420 titles had grown to 800, which says a lot about how everybody was willing to work together, but it also teaches a lesson about libraries. No library has it all. You know, and now we're doing the same thing with Cuba. And we're finding the same thing. No library, however good, however big, has it all.
Now, in the instance that Haiti, did all the contributing libraries scan in their materials themselves and send you the scans, or did they send you the material?
Most of the material was shipped. In the case of Library of Congress pays to have an internet archive. Basically, a whole production line sits at LC, and LC pays the bills. And so we use that utility to get their 200 and some titles. Columbia shipped all of theirs out. Most of the libraries shipped. In a few cases, the title was too rare to leave the building. And then we would have it done. For example, we got one from Max Planck Institute in Hamburg, which was one of only 2 copies in the world. They weren't going to ship that to Hawaii, so they did it there. So I would say maybe about 20% of it got scanned elsewhere. Oh, and also, I forgot to mention, remember we have these other extern sites. So some of the materials, it was easier to ship to St. Louis than to ship it to Hawaii, that kind of thing.
And are all of those external sites still active?
Yeah, the one in Hawaii, we pretty well did everything that the Hawaii State Archives wanted from the law department, and also they were able to use our site to bring legislators over to see how it was all going, and a lot of ingenuity. They used us basically to get their own scanner, because the legislators said, "Oh, gee, it works. It's a great idea." So once they got their own scanner, then the next target that was close by, the University of Hawaii has probably the best collection anywhere in the world for the islands of the South Pacific. And much better than LC, much better than the French Bibliothèque Nationale. And there's a reason for that. You can't subscribe to stuff out there. You have to go out and glean it. And so for the last, I think we're going on 70 years now, University of Hawaii every year has sent someone to circle the islands and literally go through and gather the stuff up and bring it back. So everyone in that particular subject area has known that UH has that marvelous collection. And so particularly with the urging of LC, which is a close partner of us, we're doing the South Pacific Island stuff within the university in their rare book rooms. And that LC's using it to finish off their own collections because they could never get the stuff. So that scanner has moved. The one at LA County has been there for a long, long time. I think they're going on 7 years now. SLU has been going for about 7 years, GWU for about 7 years. So they're pretty stable. And they got plenty to do.
Yes. Who are your mentors or role models, and what one lasting lesson did you learn from each of them?
I think the one person who was a mentor to me from a library point of view was Bev Pooley, my boss at Michigan. And the one thing he taught me, he's now retired and in fact deceased, but the one thing he taught me was if you're in a law library, you can delegate just about everything there is there. But the important thing is to know and to run your collection. And that's probably, it certainly served me good going out to Hawaii where I had to start from scratch. But basically I had the advantage that in a library, which at the time was one of the 5 biggest, and possibly the 3rd biggest budget, it happened to be very flush in those days. I spent 3 happy years spending a lot of money buying books in every country in the world, so that was great fun. But basically he taught me that's the soul of the library, and that's, since you have to delegate a lot, do delegate a lot, but keep a very firm hand on the collection development. And so that has certainly helped me building the Hawaii Library, and then in essence, LMC is just another library. I'm just building another collection. So it was the most useful. And going back on that, one of the luckiest things that happened to me, and I've had a lot of luck, one of the luckiest things is my very first summer there, the library had just made the decision to completely reshelve every book in the library in a new plan. 10 stories of stacks and about 60,000 volumes out in the reading room. And the theory was, hey, why don't we shelve in the reading room the things that actually are used the most and push everything back into sets that's not used. Which
was that your idea, or was that?
No, that had been decided before I got there. It literally had happened weeks before I got there. And to give an example, you don't need the full run of the Harvard Law Review on the reading room. Most of it doesn't get used much, but the last 5 years may. And so the entire collection was reconfigured with that concept in mind. And I got in and found out that that was going to be my job, was to spend the next year moving every book in the library. And gee, that was, one, not only was it fun, I sort of like physical things anyway, but, and you know, I had a crew of 30 kids running around, but I literally knew every book in the library. I had literally touched it, so watched it on a shelf and knew where it was going, and it was a great way to learn fast. Yeah, loved it.
Now, if you were to give one piece of advice to new librarians today, would it be the same piece of advice or a different suggestion?
I think it would be the same piece of advice. Learn the guts of the game. The guts of the game is the literature. And everything else is going to change in lots of ways. But no matter how you're handling it, you're still dispensing a library and some body of knowledge off to your patrons. And if you don't know what it is, you're not doing your job right.
How about for law library directors, especially as so many of us are now digitizing materials?
Mm-hmm.
Is there a piece of advice that you would give them as they enter this new arena of collections?
Try hard not to reinvent the wheel. And try hard, if at all possible, to do it in conjunction with others. I've seen, the digital thing is now about 10 years old, so we've seen a lot of coming and goings already. And a lot of wasted effort too. I think that the more people can do it synchronously, and merging both their energies and their funds, but also their thoughts, so that they're doing something that's really contributing to a whole.
Great. Moving to a combination of personal and professional. In your years in libraries or in publishing, did you face any discrimination based on your sexual orientation?
You can never give a proper answer to that because you never know things that you don't know. So there may have been, but of the things that I do know, most of the time not. I have one thing, I've always been lucky in that sort of thing. I've lived in a very liberal community in Ann Arbor, Michigan, and I go to an even more liberal community in Hawaii. So no particular problem. I did have one dean one time that he really made it obvious that the dislike stemmed from more than just the fact that I was brash. But he took a curious way of expressing it. When he came in, he removed me from all the committees. And I think I couldn't get the grin off of my face fast enough because 6 months later I was back on the committees. But it was like being gloriously demoted, and please don't throw me in that briar patch. Now, I don't know, I can't claim it was only because he made it public he didn't like gays. I don't know if it was that. It might have been, like I said, I was too brash and I was his predecessor, which didn't help him either. But that was the only time I ever consciously saw something, like I said, I could hardly get the grin off of my face. I had 6 glorious months of no work. In fact, and LMC benefited because I put all the energy into LMC.
For librarians who might be facing similar circumstances, is there any piece of advice you'd give to them?
Well, basically, the world has changed a lot. I mean, in my earlier years, the rubric was you didn't push it in anyone's face. And as long as you didn't push it in anyone's face, most people were pretty tolerant. Nowadays, it seems to me that just about everybody's tolerant, or at least everybody within the worlds in which they will circulate. Yeah.
You chaired the AALL committee that drafted the organization's ethics document in 1975-76. How did you become involved in that project?
I got stuck with it. Jane Hammond was the president at the time, and there had been a committee working for the previous 11 years trying to get together an ethics code. And Jane, I don't know if you have ever heard of Jane. She was a tough lady, a great lady. I had a great sense of humor too. But Jane, I was in my second year in AALL, and she met me in a hallway somewhere and said, "Jerry, I've had my eye on you. I've got a job for you." And I said, "What's that?" She said, "You're going to be head of the ethics committee." And I wouldn't say it on camera, but she basically said, I'm giving you 2 years. You either give me an ethics code or you get rid of that committee. and she was just disgusted. So we went ahead and did it. It was necessary. The world has changed a lot since then, but there was a lot of open things going on with the publishers. People were taking kickbacks and known to be doing so. Publishers were, it was getting very blatant. And the complaints were coming not only up the chain from other librarians complaining about their bosses, but from deans complaining to AALL. So it was getting to be close to a public scandal. And she said, we can't be a profession that's having this kind of stuff go on, and we don't even have an official policy on it. So yeah, we got the thing done in a year.
And in terms of drafting it, did you draw inspiration from any other policies that are out
Yeah,
there?
oh yeah, there's other associations. We took, ALA had one. They existed. It was bizarre that we didn't have one for our association. And as far as you asked advice for what new librarians coming up, one of the problems you had is you had these big committees with lots of people on committees that didn't do anything. And so we just started a rule. I sent out, this was back in the typing days. This is way before digital, and which means you had to take account of 3 weeks for the mail and that kind of thing. But the first letter I wrote to the committee, I said, this is going to be a working committee, and anybody who isn't working won't be on the committee. And so the committee shrunk from about 40 to about 15 by the end of the year, and great, got it done. If you didn't answer the first mail, you didn't get a second one.
That's fantastic.
Yeah.
So we're nearing the end of this interview, but before we wind up, I wanted to see if there was anything we haven't covered that you'd like to share.
No, you've been pretty, you don't have any more questions?
No, that's
In
it.
reserve? No, it's been a nice long run. I never thought I'd be in this, I think I once told you in one of our emails, John Lennon said, life is what happens to you while you're making other plans. Well, that's sort of what my life has been. I did not plan to be in law librarians. I did not plan to go to 45 consecutive AALL conventions. And I've only done that because I have to be at the booth all the time. I would have skipped 1 or 2 in some places.
Where was your first AALL?
My first AALL was Washington, the old Shoreham Hotel. I think it's still there. The whole association met in that hotel. I think there may have been a few people outside, but basically we're all sitting in that one hotel.
So aside from the size, has anything else changed about these meetings?
Oh yeah, it's a much different profession. I think much more, and anyone who's been around will tell you that it used to be very much dominated by the academic institutions, and about 15 years in my experience, the law firms finally started to come on in bigger numbers, and the people of law librarians working for other than law schools, and it's changed very much in that respect. It may be going back. In these last couple of years, there seems to be an erosion among the law firms, but certainly they have dominated it for the last 20 years or so, in sheer numbers.
All right, thank you, Jerry, for allowing us to visit with you today and for taking these moments to share so much about yourself and our profession.
Great,
Thank you.
thank you.